What's going on, everybody? We're trying out a new format for a show. It's called Thinking Critically, where I invite one guest to share their thoughts on something, and we engage in meaningful and deep dialogue. Maybe we even debate a little bit. So today on the show, we're having Alec Miller, and he has a point of view on something that I've said, and he's responded to it. So I want to expand on this and see where we net out at the end of the day. Let's get into it.
I'm Alec Miller. I'm the founder of Royals and Rogues. I have about over 10 years experience in the industry, and I believe in brutal honesty, but I'm not afraid at all to admit when I'm wrong. And I think that Chris has said some stuff that rubbed a few of us in different ways, and I just wanted to jump on and discuss it with him.
Perfect.
So what kind of set everyone off was you started this protocol called What is an Expert, and how do you define expertise? And it was super valuable, and there's a ton of really great information. But one of the things that you said in there was an expert is someone who knows a little more than you, or someone that can help you solve a problem. And I think when I watched it back and looked into it, this is where people kind of found a lot of the tension and how they traditionally defined expert, and then how you were kind of redefining it and getting people to question their assumptions. And I kind of came at it from the point that I thought it was important to keep some objectivity in the term expert, I guess, and not just make it completely subjective as someone that just knows a little more than you. And so this is kind of the prompting for the debate. So I guess my first question is that still how you define expert?
It's actually the beginning of that call I said was, I think it was Seth Godin who said that an expert is someone who knows a little bit more than you. And even if they learned it 5 minutes before, they're considered an expert. And I think that the problem where a lot of people were getting their feathers ruffled was, I'm not saying I'm an expert. The expert is in the eye of the beholder. So I'm not running around claiming that I am an expert at anything. But people do call you an expert because you've been able to help them. Or if you've been able to create one viral video, they're looking for your expertise. And if we take a bigger step back, it's like, why are we even having this conversation about experts in the first place? And for me, the reason is so many of us suffer from imposter syndrome, that we're not willing to make content because we're waiting to arrive at becoming an expert. If you're following Malcolm Gladwell's rule about 10,000 hours of singular practice at doing one thing, then that would pretty much exclude all of us. And it would rob many creative people from the ability to share what they know, and also, more importantly, to help others in their pursuit of the same goal. And that's really where it's coming from. And I think people got hung up with like, well, are you saying you're an expert? I'm not saying that. I don't think on record I've said I'm an expert, ever.
So that was actually kind of funny, because you used the same argument in the group.
So I'm consistent.
Well, but that's what prompted me to go and look through all of your archives of videos of everywhere you talked about being an expert. And in multiple videos, it does say, expert teaches, not newbie, but like young gun or something like that, or learn from an expert, right? Okay. So that might not be you necessarily calling yourself one, but it is your company calling you an expert. So it feels that way. And originally I was looking at that as kind of a got you, right? Like, aha, see, you do call yourself an expert. Now there's a couple problems with that. One is you change your beliefs about things fairly quickly, as you've admitted yourself. So it's not really a got you. You could easily just say like, well, that's before I realized that you shouldn't run around calling yourself an expert. The other thing was, by doing that, I actually got to look into a lot of what you actually said on the subject. And that's where that kind of little compilation video came from. If people haven't seen it, I'm sure you'll link it somewhere. And that's, I think, where we both come down to is, the idea of changing from, calling yourself an expert and making these claims and that being the focus of why people should listen to you, to just sharing your story and being honest. Now, I do think I still want to kind of get into it a little bit, because I do think being an expert is important. And why I think it's important is because eventually you want to get to a point where you do have some sort of knowledge on the subject, right? You have something you're working towards. And so having this kind of qualitative expert, right? Something that's actually kind of set as these are the requirements to be an expert. I think it's kind of important. I don't think people should get so caught up in worrying about being an expert or not being an expert that it stops them from sharing. But I think having that standard is good, because it gives me something to work towards, and it gives me a goal to look. Even if it's just someone that knows more than me, that's still a goal, right? It's like, well, I need to learn more then. I think the danger with throwing out the expert or saying, let's just, don't bother qualifying anything, can be misinterpreted. I'm not saying you're saying that, but I'm saying like, I think people can misinterpret that as like, well, I don't need to be an expert, right? There's no need for me to know anything about the subject. I can just give my opinion on it, and people can just learn, take whatever they want. And there's no need for me to ever improve. And I think that's a danger that can come from that sort of mentality.
In David Baker's book, David C. Baker, in his book, The Business of Expertise, he says that it's important for all of us, regardless of what field you're in, is to find a direction, claim an area of focus, and for a period of time, everyone is faking it for a little bit. So if you say, and you have to say something like, to say like, I'm a brand strategist, and you just learn that term, and this is the direction that you want to focus in on. So you don't know anything, but you're putting it out to the universe that this is how I define myself, and this is the kind of work that I want. This is how I'm positioned in the marketplace. So then the rest of the time you acquire skills, you read books, you attend seminars, you do workshops, you practice, you learn. However you learn, doesn't really matter. You can go to school and get a degree. But we claim some form of focus. One could use the word expertise until we arrive at that thing. And I still am an advocate for saying that you don't necessarily get to define that yourself. Usually these are things that people say about you. Like when they introduce you on a TED Talk, he's an expert at content marketing or video creation or creating viral hits, etc. I don't know that many people, honestly, that go out and say, I'm an expert at this. They usually use a third person testimonial to say that. First of all, because it sounds better, it's credible, and you have social proof, all those kinds of things. And so I don't want us to go around saying, well, I'm not going to claim anything because I'm not there. That's the danger of that. Now, let's get back into your argument to say that just because it's okay, we're giving people permission to say, like, I'm going to focus on something and I could fake it for a little while I learn and level up. Is a danger that we are really thinking that people will say that I want to do this and never invest in that time? And do we see a lot of examples of that? So I'm a big believer in the Pareto principle that 80% of your results come from 20% of the effort. Are we worrying about the less than, I think, 20% of people who want to fake it and be disingenuous and inauthentic about who they are and what they do? And we're going to design the entire 80% of like how to talk to people and coach people around that, not anomaly, but that exception versus the rule. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a little more than that, because I think that there's a couple of things you said. So one of them is the fake it till you make it type mantra, which is something I actually like vehemently disagree with. I don't believe in faking anything. And that's part of this brutal honesty that I am a part of. I think it's really important. You can make a claim, which is fine, because at some point someone has to put you in some sort of box, right? Like you can't just run around marketing or advertising that you're just a guy that just tries to do things, right? Or something that vague. And that's like, might be the most honest way of looking at it. Or someone that's curious about art or something like that, or design, which is funny though, because it's usually when someone that really has succeeded, that's usually how they start marketing themselves, right? But when you start, you need to be able to be put in some sort of box so someone can find you, right? You need to be at least say like, I'm a designer, right? If you want to get the design jobs. And so there's that claim that you make. Now, I think that claim has to come along with sharing as much information as possible about your journey and about who you are, and making that really clear. I think it's not on the viewer. You have to share it before the viewer gets there. I think here's a good example of this, okay, is like, let's say you have a product, right? And the product is some sort of artisan, thing, like a whiskey or an olive oil or something like that. But you're actually just sourcing it. You're not making it yourself. So if you put it on the shelf and you say all these great things about it, and then someone finds out that, well, you're not making this, you're just buying it, that feels really bad for the consumer. And then that leads to mistrust. Now, you didn't intentionally do anything wrong, which I think most of us aren't doing. Most of us I don't think are intentionally misleading people. We're just putting some stuff out there and making these claims because it's like, well, that's what everyone else does, and I'm going to say I'm a designer too. But I think it's up to you to clarify and add in that little bit of extra information of, here's the background where this is coming from. And then people that are curious that go and look can find the answers. And when they find those answers, it feels a lot better to go, oh, they're transparent about sourcing. They say here that they found this thing and they're providing it to an audience, and that they just wanted to bring it to you, and that's what they're doing. And so that honesty brings transparency. So you're trying to say it's like 20% of people are doing this, but I think it kind of happens to almost everybody. It's like the natural state of things as you progress, a misalignment happens, right? And what people actually know about you is very little. So, I think it's about sharing and being honest about your about what you're doing as well as making a claim, right? So the claim by itself can be a problem, and then faking it leads to maybe more faking it sometimes. So that's why I think the honesty has to come alongside that faking it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you bring up so many points. I've already filled up 2 pages here.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And so I like this first part where you say, I disagree with this vehemently, meaning like you have a visceral reaction to the statement, fake it till you make it. Now, I personally don't love that sentiment. What I was saying that everybody starts as an imposter at some point or a faker. Everybody, even the person who graduates design school and says, I'm a designer. Well, what are your credentials? What school did you go to? How many client jobs? How many hours have you spent? So even in that sense, we are faking it. We are an imposter for a minute until you actually have a paying client. Like, you can't call yourself a professional designer theoretically until this is your primary source of income. So do we just all say from here on out, if Alec were the ruler of the world, he would decree from this point forward, all you can say is, I'm human. It's like you have to be able to put yourself in a category and to allow other people to understand who you are shorthand because of heuristics. Like, we need a shorthand way of understanding people. So the title is usually how we're able to communicate that. If you're attending a social function, somebody's like, they'll ask you, what do you do? Instantly they ask you, what do you do? They don't ask you where you're from. They don't want to know your whole life story. They just want to know, what do you do? So you say, what? And there could be a moment where you're really not that person yet, but you're on a path. The danger that you say, and I agree with, so I don't think there's disagreement here, is if you say I'm a brand strategist and you just learned the word, so you throw out a buzz, and you have really no intention of pursuing this path. It's just because you're looking for a shortcut in life. I'm not advocating for that at all. The reason why is because they will find out really quickly. And then you have to live with that. And to me, a damaged reputation is much harder to recover from. And Errol Garrison said this, if you do something good, they tell one person. If you do something bad, they tell 10 people. So if you make a product and the origin and the history of it is totally disingenuous, the market will validate whether or not they care or not. And there are tons of things out there, tons, probably way more than you recognize, that aren't exactly what you think they are. And they just kind of keep quiet about it. Let's talk about, there's several things here I wrote, right? Automotive industry. Where are the parts sourced? If they say they're a German or a Swedish company, or they're a Japanese company, or an American car company, where are the parts sourced? And maybe you don't care. One of the biggest companies that does this is Apple. Almost all of their technology is manufactured in China. And they say designed in Cupertino because it sounds cooler. Now, do you care where your iPhone comes from? Are they being inauthentic? Are they saying that we design a product based on a vision and to a specification that we will be consistent with, and nothing gets out unless it passes a certain test from us? And at that point, do you really care? And you don't have to look that far. If you walk down the shelf of any supermarket, you'll see tons and tons of bottles of water. They claim all kinds of things. And then you turn around, it's like bottled in Michigan or bottled in, and it's like this romantic idea. And that's just really because we actually like to have a story, and it is a story. It's not always like, hey, this is 1000% true. So I think the market will decide what they care about. I think we're overreacting to the idea that there are really mischievous, disingenuous, inauthentic people who are really looking to take shortcuts and saying like, let's design the rule for the exception. There are some of those people out there, and the market vets them out really quickly, especially today in the age of social media. When somebody does something, I just saw it yesterday on Twitter. Somebody called out a social influencer and that she's posing against all these images, but the clouds are literally exactly the same. People will spot that and then they'll call you out. And then the market gets to decide we care or we don't care. I just want to make sure we stay on this one point because you have a strong feeling about this, which is there are people out there who want to take advantage of things and claim things. Now, are there a lot of those people, and have they hurt you in the past? And are you thinking that this message that I'm sending out there is promoting that kind of thinking?
I don't think that there's that many of those people. I think those people are all of us, right? I think it's very easy to come into this because people know so little about you, like you were saying, and we know so little about all of our products. And so my solution for this is like the brutal honesty of being, and that's not just answering questions when they come, which is, I think, a big part of it is if someone asks you, where are you getting this from? You should tell them and not be afraid to tell them. And you should be confident. And then you should say, well, why? And it's like, well, because this is what makes sense for us financially. And then why did you brand this way? Well, because we have a passion for Japanese culture, right? And you just honestly lay it out. Now, where the problem comes is when we, and someone just started a lawnmower, I don't know if you can hear it, but is when we fall into this kind of trap of like, well, nobody really knows what they're doing, right? Because inevitably what happens is someone comes along that does know what you're doing, and then you look kind of stupid. And so I think that the honesty part of it for me is what is really important. Is you can have a product and you can have, you know, a lot of information about it, but obviously people aren't going to read all that information. But when they go to look, that they'll find the correct information. And I'm kind of repeating myself. Let me stop for a second. Your point is that you don't know that much about anything, right? And that's what leads to this problem, is people come up with a narrative in their own heads about the product or about the person. So all I am doing, let's say, as a designer, is I start teaching design stuff, and I start going around talking about it. Or for me, it's running a motion graphics company, right? And I'm talking about the creative industry. I'm talking about how things could change. And then someone goes and looks into my past, and they're like, wait a second, this guy never graduated from high school. This guy never graduated from college. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about, right? And then there's suddenly this problem where, well, I never claimed to be those things. I never claimed to have done any of those things. But people have written this narrative in their own head by watching this thing and assuming that all those things were true. And then they feel bad when it's not true. So my solution to that is, well, put it out there. Like, just put that information out there. And if somebody wants to find it, they can. And if someone doesn't want to find it, then there's no problem. They can keep on not caring, right? But that information does need to exist somewhere, and you should be genuine about that. And if someone asks, especially, then you have to tell, in my mind, the truth. Otherwise, very quickly, like you said, someone's going to find out.
Okay. I'm not advocating by any sense of lying and fibbing, telling untrue things and hiding things. Actually, I'm an advocate for radical transparency. You, as a member of the Pro Group, and people who've watched our channel, know how much I disclose in the most transparent way I know how. So I'm not advocating for that, but I'm also saying that you don't need to tell everybody on the first introduction everything that you think they might be concerned about. And if a client asks you, and I don't know if you've ever done this, Alec, if you use remote freelancers from time to time, if you subcontract work out, do you make it a point to tell your client when they first call you, by the way, I just need to let you know, I have 3 subcontractors, one's from China, one's from Sweden, and one's from Chicago. Do you begin the conversation there?
I don't start the conversation that way, but that's a big part of our branding, actually, is just the way we do the work. Like, the process is up front. So it's very much so right away we state that the whole goal of the company is to connect, clients to artists. And it says that like right up front. So that's not really a problem I think I have, because anyone that's hiring us, that's even gone to our website for like 5 seconds would know that information. But I do understand what you're saying. Like, do I right away? It's like, here's what's in my bank account, right? Like, when I meet somebody, or like, hey, I got this huge flaw or whatever,
right.
Not exactly. No, I don't start it that way, but I do it very quickly. And I think the faster you can get to that point, the better. And especially if someone asks, being able to say like, yeah, actually, I haven't worked on a design project outside of school yet. Right. Is, I think, the best way to remove the fear of, when the client asks, oh, how long have you been doing design? And you say something like, oh, like 8 years. And they're like, oh, that's really great. And then like all 8 of those were in school, which I don't think is necessarily a lie or a problem. But then if you keep avoiding them finding out this thing, eventually it gets to the point where they're like, well, I've asked you a lot of questions, and each time you've never come up with a straight answer of, oh, I graduated high school, or whatever, college or whatever, so many years ago. And it can lead to that, this imposter syndrome that we've been talking about. So I think we're in agreement here. Like, I think
let me just jump in there. I think we're drifting a little bit. We're drifting from me encouraging mostly a creative community that it's okay for you to stake a claim, for you to be learning while you're doing it, and to be sharing it with people. The slide that's still stuck up on the screen right now says someone who knows a little bit more than you. And, it takes this language of you, the beholder, not I know a little bit more than you, therefore I am an expert. It also says someone who can help you solve a problem. So in both those statements that are quoted from a discussion we had, it's from the eye of the beholder. And this is really important. So when you disclose things about yourself, I think what you're trying to do is to give the person who's making a decision information that's relevant to them, because there's A, too much information for you to share, and B, it's inappropriate. You're not really paying attention to the client. For example, I don't know how many times somebody would do this, but say, oh, before you hire us, I want to let you know the 14 times in which we screwed up in the past 8 years that I've worked. That's not relevant to them right now. And that's also a reflection of your past. But if they said, have you ever dropped the ball before? You said, yes, here's where it went bad. Have you ever launched a campaign for dogs that have gotten 1 million views? No, I've not. Don't lie. Don't lie. I'm not advocating for lying. So saying and encouraging people to pursue a path and to say that this is how you start to build expertise. And when somebody looks at you like you know more than them and you can help them, they're going to look at you like an expert. It's giving you permission to accept that title from people. And you can even say, I'm not an expert at this. I'm still learning, which is often the times how I describe what I'm doing. So I don't want somebody to say and conflate, I'm giving you permission to pursue something versus telling people to lie. They're not the same at all. And I don't know why it is that it's viewed this way, but it's not the same to me. Are we clear on that or no?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're clear on that. And I think we're in agreement. And I think that
Great.
What I'm pushing it back against a little bit is multiple things. And that's why I think this is kind of, tricky to nail down. But I think a lot of it is the subjectivity of being an expert, which is kind of what my deck's built around. So that's why we're still on this one slide, because we got off on that making the fake it till you make it line.
Should we dive deeper into your deck then?
Yeah, we can. We can dive deeper into the deck.
Okay.
So I was thinking that you were going to say yes, that was my definition, right? And then I could be like, okay, well,
right.
Okay, so I think it's rubbing people the wrong way. Right. So you kind of dodged it and said like, well, it's not my definition, it's these other people's definition. And then you talked about faking it. So anyway, the dictionary definition of expert is having or involving or displaying some skill or knowledge derived from training or expertise, right? Which is what I think most people kind of think of as an expert, but that's still kind of vague. So the way I kind of summarize it is someone who can demonstrate a level of proficiency in a subject that is uncommon, right? And now that makes very few people experts, like you were saying. But I think that's kind of the point, right? Like the point of being one of the top runners in the world is that you're like, it's exclusive, right? And so I think in my mind, that's a good thing. It's a good thing because it gives you, once again, something to work towards. It gives you something so that when you're sitting there and you don't know where you are, you're like, well, I can get towards that. And I think part of the problem is, and what I was hoping to get to in this conversation, is maybe coming up with some ways that people can define themselves that isn't just this expert or nothing, kind of status that we kind of view, ourselves as. We kind of view it as like, either I'm an expert and people should listen to me, or I'm not an expert and then nobody should listen to me, which is, I think, a not a healthy way to look at it. So one way of attacking that is saying, well, let's just get rid of this concept of expert, right? Let's just label anyone that knows more than anyone else an expert. And now everyone's free to talk. And I think the other way to do that is, well, maybe we don't just get rid of the term expert and people's expectations for that term. And rather we figure out a new way of talking about ourselves that isn't necessarily this expert, not expert mindset.
Okay, I'd like to respond here. We're going to have a really long conversation. Unfortunately, I have 30 more minutes to do this with you. Okay, so I'm like, oh, I got to get on this. Okay, this is fantastic. So in your own, you are redefining the word expert yourself. So are you the expert at defining experts?
No, I just think it's an easier way to understand within our context, because this is the correct definition, but it's a little vague. So really I think when people see this is what I'm saying is not my definition, but what I think people have in their heads when they hear expert, right? It's someone that's as a proficiency that's kind of rare, which is what makes it desirable.
I don't know about the rare part, but okay.
Or uncommon, or at least.
Well, it means the same thing. It means that there are only a few people who deserve that label. Now, here's a couple of things. And you're right. Like, do we say expert or nothing? Because in this case here, very few people are, so nobody's an expert. So we should trust nobody and listen to nobody or anybody. So let's
I
talk
didn't
about
say
this.
that, but yes.
Well, that's really what it's boiling down to, right? Expert or nothing. So then, like, I don't want to listen to anybody because you don't have the requisite definition per Alex's understanding of it, which is it's very uncommon. Okay, so let's talk about this a couple times here. There's subjective and objective. Subjective is, I say, or I'm asking a question, who gets to decide if you're an expert? I think we all individually have a right to call anybody an expert if we want to. It's because, or an expert, you could say is a teacher or a coach or a therapist, somebody who helps you. So I get to decide that. However, if you want an objective measure, you can say won the gold medal for the 100-meter dash or won X in Y. And then you can say that's an objective measure because there's a competition, a definition, parameters, and you get to win that. So if you say you won a Clio or an Academy Award, not many people can say that. So those are more objective measures. And it's still like debatable if those mean anything, but at least then you can say yes or no, black or white. So I don't have a problem with that. I keep coming back to this is who gets to decide? Are you in agreement that the person who looks at the world gets to decide, or is it the person who's saying I'm an expert gets to decide?
I don't think the person gets to claim they're an expert, but at the same time, I think the concept that someone can be proficient enough at something to be considered an expert, and that while that measurement is made up of like many, many things, and it's unique per industry, unique per like person, essentially, right? I don't know if an individual is the one that gets to decide for everybody who an expert is, right? Because I think that's where we get into this kind of this hard part. If someone turns to somebody else and goes like, this guy's an expert, he really knows what he's talking about. And someone else looks at that guy and goes like, well, no, he doesn't, right? So then the argument would be like, well, for you, he's an expert, and then for you, he's not, right? But then the problem is, well, how do you go about talking about that person, and how do you go about making claims about that person, right? When someone goes, this guy is an expert, and then, you know, you understand what I'm trying to get as where the problem is.
I do, but here's where I think some of this breaks down. Alec, you say you should listen to Chris. He's an expert at building social communities online. You have now put your reputation on the line to the person that you're speaking to. If that person digs into it and turns out to be true, you have gained social status in that person's mind. You've built trust. And if it turns out to be untrue, whose reputation is damaged? Yours, because you're the one who's making that claim, not the person that you're pointing to because they've never made that claim. So this is where it gets really interesting. So I'm going to ask you this question, and hopefully we can get to this. Is Alex, what are you an expert at?
I don't claim to be an expert at pretty much anything.
Well, you see,
Right.
then would your client say Alec is not an expert at anything?
No.
Of course. So what are they going to say? What would they say?
I'm an expert at creating engaging content.
There you go. And how do you feel about that claim?
It's true, but it's not completely based in opinion, right? I do have results that I can point to. And so that's kind of where it comes down to is, would I still be an expert if they said that thing and I thought that thing, yet what I was making actually wasn't that thing at all?
Okay, that was confusing, that last part.
So let's say that instead of claiming to be an expert at whatever, I claim to be an expert at making tacos, right? Or someone says I'm an expert at making tacos. And then I go like, yeah, I think I am. And then it turns out that I'm not making tacos at all. I'm actually making pancakes. And then somebody's like, no, that guy's not an expert. And you called him one, and everyone started talking him up, but really the king has no clothes, right?
Yes, those are very extreme cases here. And I'm just not sure that there's enough of that out there that hasn't already vetted itself out, that's been exposed, that we'll keep circling back to that. That's like the reducing it down to the absurd. And I just don't know where that's coming from. And let's take a look at real life examples if we can.
Okay.
All
so
right. Here, I'll give you some real life examples. There are a bunch of YouTube people who are primarily self-taught, who have actually no training in making videos or being a host or whatever it is that they're doing. I'll give you a couple, and we enjoy the content or we don't, and we make a decision individually. DeMarcus Brownlee talks about tech. He doesn't have an engineering background. He's a kid who started making videos, and he really gets into tech reviews, right? Will Patterson is teaching people how to design logos. He's also self-taught. And then Roberto Blake, these guys are friends of the channel. He's like helping people learn how to create videos on YouTube through a lot of trial and error. all self-taught. Now, is there an objective measure against that? Probably not. And in your own response to the question is, I asked you, are you an expert? You say, I don't claim to be an expert. And then simultaneously, you would say, well, my clients claim that I am, and I can't argue. So do you think you're an expert or not at engaging content?
Okay, so that's a good way to look at it. I think that the DeMarcus Brownlee one, not DeMarcus Brownlee, the Roberto Blake one's really interesting, because what I'm trying to break down is, I think in some ways, by trying to teach other people something, you kind of make an expert claim. And I think that's one of the things that rubs us the wrong way, because he's someone that rubbed me the wrong way many years ago, where he was teaching design, and among others, he taught a lot of different stuff. And it was a very mile wide, kind of inch deep type teaching. And I went to look at his work, and it was underwhelming at the time. I don't know if he's improved or whatever. But at the time I felt like this is really underwhelming work. And I was like, this really rubbed me the wrong way. And this is what I'm trying to kind of get at, I guess, is, was it on me for making the assumption that, he's teaching people, he must know what he's doing, he's teaching design. And then looking at me like, oh, well, I don't know if I want to learn from somebody that's design doesn't look the way I want my design to look, let's just say, even subjectively. And then you kind of feel bad, and it's like, okay, was that all on the person, the viewer, just, going off, or were you putting yourself out there as an educator, as someone knowledgeable on the subject, as someone that people should listen to? And then when people started listening to it, and you're telling them subscribe for more, tons of valuable information, and then you find out like, oh, they don't really know what they're doing. Like, who's that on? Like, is that on you, or is that on the viewer? And
right.
My solution to that is start telling people, here's what I know, here's what I don't know. And then if they look for it, they'll find that out, right? And so that's where we kind of get back to this.
Okay, let's stay on this one. This is a great example to talk about, and I think we can find nuance in how we perceive things, okay? He said, I'm a working designer, and I'm a professional. I've gone to school, I have training, and I have clients, and I've done these things before. Whether or not you personally, Alec, say to yourself, he's worthy of somebody who meets my standards of somebody I would consider an expert. And between you and me, my own list of designers I would consider amazing is very small, but that should not preclude other people from wanting to teach design. And you and I get to decide. His level of expertise is less than ours or more than ours. And he obviously has taught a lot of people things that have helped them in their career and their lives. And I don't want to rob him of that ability just because you or I or somebody else may turn our nose up and say, well, that's not fine design. That's not it at all. And I think it would be absurd to say that you are not allowed to teach until you have done all that you need to do to pass somebody's standard. So does Alec get to decide he's an expert while he has 200,000 or 300,000 followers who say, you know what, you've taught me a lot?
Right. No, and I agree. I think that we shouldn't be stopping people from teaching just because they haven't reached this quota. But at the same time, I think with great power comes great responsibility, right? That old Spider-Man quote. And I think the more you're put into a position of authority, whether you chose to be put in that position or not, the more responsibility you have to make it clear to your audience and to other people exactly where you're coming from. Like, I think it's really valuable that you do this, right? You will tell people, like, I've just read 5 books, right? And then I know, okay, well, I'm learning from a guy that just read 5 books, right? Which is fine for learning marketing or something else. It's like, now if you said, look, I've just learned 5 books. Now, here's how you operate on somebody, then I might hesitate. And I know I go to these extremes, but I think that, I don't think it's that uncommon, as I guess is what I'm saying. And I don't think people are intentionally trying to mislead people. I think the natural state of things is unalignment. And it takes work to create that alignment. And so, yeah.
Now, in Roberto's case, he does tell you what he's done and hasn't done, and you can look it all up. So then I think you're making a case for, well, you should say, I'm not really a good designer by Alec's standard, because he thinks he's a good designer. How would he know that he's not? And some people love Pentagram's work and some people do not. And if you get on the design internet, they all have a wildly different opinion. So who gets to decide? And so I think it's self-evident. If he says, I'm a practicing designer, I teach you how to make design. You can easily look up his work and see, A, there's nothing there, or what you see isn't for you. So there's not even a need to say, well, I don't meet a certain post-Bauhaus, postmodern aesthetic of design, and I'm not at the level of the upper echelons of design. I've never won a design award or whatever. He doesn't even need to say that. You get to just look at it. And here's my thing, and this is just a worldview, if I may take one little tangent here, is that everybody can be your teacher. You can learn so much if you just open up your mind to say, you know what? I actually learned how to cut out hair by watching one of his tutorials. I'm like, let me double check if I know how to do this. I watched it, I learned. So I'm like, from a hair cutting out point of view, obviously I have that problem in Photoshop. Then he taught me that, and that's all I hold him for. And if he teaches me something else, I hold him for that. In that way, the world becomes my teacher versus like, well, who's the master Photoshop teacher? Do I have to go to master class to study this? I don't think so. So I still don't know what the harm is and how you even begin to have an objective body to determine for each individual category who gets to teach, who gets to claim something. And I think this idea of putting all the disclaimers up front is nonsensical, and I don't think it's necessary. It is self-evident. If you watch some of these hand lettering artists who are teaching you on the internet, and I can see their drawing and they don't know what they're doing, I just put them in a category like knows less than me. And I'm okay with that. And for a lot of people who don't know jack, that's actually really helpful for them. And I don't think there's a problem with that. So the design snobs, the content snobs, are all the people who are like super high elite status. They don't watch these channels. They don't derive value from it. And it's totally okay. And there's a different category for these people too. They're considered masters. And somebody else will call them that. I doubt that they would call themselves that. So again, I just don't know realistically how you do this, even if we wanted to do it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't want to read 35 paragraphs of everything that you think somebody doesn't like. Now, I'll make this super personal now. There's a lot of people who call me an expert. They even call me master. And they say what they want to say. And conversely, there are a lot of people like, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. This guy's full of crap. So what do I do in a situation like this, Alec?
I mean, for me, I think you've already done it. I think you're a good example of somebody that's more honest than you perhaps need to be, which is how I think you should be. And so when it comes to how do you deal with like the people saying that you don't know what you're talking about, I think you have the right idea. And I think you have the right idea about learning from everybody. Like I think your 2-year-old can teach you super valuable life lessons. I don't think it's a matter of filtering out who you're listening to and who you're not listening to. And I don't think it's a matter of policing what other people are saying or not saying. I think what I'm talking about is for yourself, when you're putting out information, look for alignment. Like look for that and say like, how can I create that alignment? And I don't know necessarily if Roberto Blake's putting out misinformation. I don't think he is. Like I think, like you said, he's very honest, and I don't think that's a problem. But that's what I was saying when it first rubbed me the wrong way. I was trying to figure that out. And I think, like you said, like I think in that instance, like it was mostly on me, right? Making these assumptions about him being somebody that he didn't necessarily claim to be, but he was in this position of. And so while I'm not necessarily attacking anybody for doing that, I think what we need to be looking for is, and like when you said, like, do you put out all your flaws? Like, I think at a certain point you kind of do. Like one of the things I have is I'm colorblind. And I tell people this before I do any coloring work with them. Because being in a creative industry, there's an assumption that I can see color, right? I'm not black and white colorblind. It's red, green, but it's pretty severe. And so rather than like, and I've sat in the editing bay with someone behind me telling me, hey, can you make that a little more this color? And I can't do it, right? So my solution to that was when they sit down, I say, I know we're going to do some coloring here. I'm going to go by the charts and the graphs. That's how I color. I don't trust my eyes. So if you ask me to nudge something, just understand it's going to take me a little longer. So in that case, yeah, I do put out my flaws first. I do inform people where this might be a problem, and I'm going to tell you beforehand. I take the same approach with my relationship with my wife. I tell her before something comes up and let it get to the 100th time I've done it, and she's like, I hate this thing. It's like, hey, there's this thing, and it's kind of a problem. Like, let's fix it. Let's talk about it. Or this is something that happened in my past, right, that is going to come up. I just know it's going to come up. So that's I think you're thinking, I want everyone to like, put this label on it of like, warnings and regulations, all this other stuff. What I'm saying is when you make a claim, and in that claim, or if you go to teach something and there's something in that, like when I go to edit something and there's an implied idea that I probably know what I'm talking about as far as color goes, that's where I need to put that clarification out front.
Right. I think you saying that I'm colorblind in a color correcting session is totally relevant, and that's a good time for people to know. But it also helps to let people know how they can communicate with you, which is also super important relative to you getting the job done. Those are very important pieces of information. Like somebody tells me they're hard of hearing, and so they have to lean in, or they're like, I need to see your mouth move. That's really critical piece of information. I don't even think that's throwing out disclaimers or revealing anything. It's just, this is how we can work together. And if that bothers you, you have a right to choose to work with somebody else. And right. I think what you're concerned about, I'm concerned about too, which is fraud, a total misrepresentation of what it is that you do intentionally. And I think the intention
I don't even know
word
if it's
is
intentional.
Important. Well,
like a lot of times I wouldn't intentionally tell someone I don't know color. It just seems like something I don't want to bring up. And this is why I think 70% of people deal with imposter syndrome, right? Is because there's all this information that they're like, I don't want to tell people this information. I don't want to inform them of this stuff.
No, I think that's a little bit different. I think the imposter syndrome is an inability to recognize what you're good at. So somebody's like, you have incredible musicality, or no, I don't, I can't sing anything. And he or she gets out on the microphone, belts out this amazing tune, and you're like, wow, right? And like, even with your example of like, you can play the harp, and although you can't read the things, you can play amazingly, and you can have an ear, and somebody can say, that's an amazing talent. That might even be more of an uncommon talent that's rare than somebody who can read music. And I made a note here about Danny Elfman was the same way. Like he can play, but he can't compose music on a chart like that. But that didn't stop him from scoring some amazing soundtracks for films. And so it's like, I still don't get why we're in this place. And I think we could both agree easily, so we can just move this aside. If you misrepresent something intentionally, the world's going to have a problem with that. And you're going to do a lot of harm to yourself. Right? But then there's this other part, this really kind of gray area where there's some subjective standard and you saying they're claiming to be something that they're not. I don't think, in my experience at least, there are a lot of people running around claiming something. So I'll give you an example. Hey guys, I'm not a color expert, but let me know. I figured out a really interesting color trick that might help you if you're struggling with color yourself. Is that the extent in which we need to say something?
I think it's a bit of both. You mentioned about imposter syndrome mostly being people not knowing what they're good at. Mm-hmm. But I think that's half of it, right? I think that's a huge part of it, is not being able to recognize your skill sets and what you're good at. But I think it's also not correcting the misalignment in how people perceive you, right?
Okay, I think that's a little different though.
But I think that's what an imposter is, right? The definition of imposter is when you aren't somebody, you aren't the person you say you are, right?
No, yeah,
imposter, the actual imposter syndrome.
Yeah,
so
an actual imposter is that.
I think is when you don't think you're the person people think you are, right? So your perception of yourself isn't aligned with how other people perceive you, how you think other people perceive you, not how they actually perceive you.
Well,
right?
since we want to get into the whole definition of things, I pulled it up here.
Okay.
Right? It says here that the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. Is that in alignment with what you just said? That's literally what it says. I just Googled it.
Right. I think that's close to the alignment. I think the idea is close. Right. When you say, I can't recognize my achievements because there's some secret knowledge that you have that you think is making that achievement not valid. Right. So usually it's like, well, people think I'm this great, whatever. I'm a great artist, let's say, but all I'm doing is photo bashing, right? I'm taking pictures and pushing them together and then drawing over them. So then you start discrediting yourself, going like, well, I'm not really an artist. I'm cheating. And my solution to that is tell them you photo bash. And if they still think you're a great artist, well then, at that point you can start overcoming like, okay, now why don't I think I'm one? But usually there's a bit of a lie in there about yourself that you're saying like, well, I'm not really a great student, or I'm not really a great entrepreneur. My dad just had a lot of money, right? It's like, in my mind,
I don't have any talent.
Right. I think a lot of times you correct that by saying that, by putting it out there.
Okay. We're drifting a little bit here because we're getting into imposter syndrome, which I'd love to talk to you about.
Well, I think it's all linked. I think that's why
I don't think so.
No.
Because this is like the direct TV campaign where, you know what I'm talking about? It's like when you have cable, it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, you get angry. When you get angry, you neglect your children. When you neglect your children, they wind up estranged from you, you know,
Right.
and don't get cable, get direct TV. It's like, I like to just stay on one thing, because imposter syndrome is a whole nother thing. It's just your inability to recognize what you're good at, period. That's what it says. And then we can get into symptoms and how you solve it. But that's a whole nother subject. I think when I say, you know, you guys, I would like to help you build expertise. And then everybody's like, no, you have to get a PhD. You have to do this. You have to do 10,000 hours. And I'm like, that's one path. That is one path. But let's start by reading some books and like applying what you've learned. And then I say, why don't you tell me what you've learned? Because the act of doing it is only one step. The act of processing it and then applying it to something in the real world demonstrates that you've actually learned the concept. Hence, the reason why I tell people I've read 5 books and they still want to learn from me, because I learn a little differently than most people, I would say. So I can read that book and squeeze every last drop of knowledge out of it, versus somebody who reads it's like, I don't remember 3 things. Right. And I think what the bell signals that were going off in everybody's head, the alarms, were Chris is talking about this, and they immediately go into fraudulent or, you know, making claims that you can't back up, and then not correcting people when they ask you that. That's a whole nother issue altogether. So if somebody says, I hear you're an expert at branding or creating engaging content, you have an opportunity to clarify. And usually my generic default advice to anybody would be to say something like this: I'm not an expert at that, but I can tell you the results that I've gotten, and you can discern for yourself if I'm an expert. Or you can say, I'm not sure I'm an expert at it, but here's the things I've been able to do. Then they get to decide. So I still am adamant for expert or expertise is in the eye of the beholder. They get to decide, just like value, beauty, and fairness.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we mostly agree. And this has kind of been my goal of this conversation, is to get this clarification, right? Because I think but see, this is exactly what I'm talking about in some ways. Like, I think we say something and people read a bunch of stuff into it. Like when you said, like, well, experts is one of those, and everyone starts freaking out and be like, well, what about dishonest people? What about that? What about that? And it's like, okay, well, now clarify, right? And so to me, I don't know. I think you can do that through this, and you can do that through people asking you questions, or I think you can get ahead of it, right? And you can clarify, you know, obviously based on context of the situation, but I think more clarification is better than less, and people can always leave it, right? So, and this is exactly what this conversation is, which is why what makes me kind of excited about it. It's like, oh, good, Chris and I aren't just completely opposite ballparks where, you know, he thinks you can just say you are whatever you want to be, and then it's up to people to figure out whether or not you're telling the truth. It's like, no, like, don't make claims about things that are completely untrue, but you do have to start somewhere, and you do have to start. So yeah, I think that, I don't know, to me, this proves a lot of what I'm talking about, of like, the clarification to me is immensely important. Right. And then when somebody makes an assumption about you, that's wrong. Like, people make wrong assumptions all the time. It's just what we have to do to get by in life. Right. But I think the more you can get out there and say, like, hey, I think you're assuming this, or you might, I say something and I know the assumption might be that whatever it is, I know how to color. So let me correct that before it becomes an issue. Because I think we see a lot of these issues and where a lot of these heads butt, like you're talking about with these people like judging everybody. I think why they feel this way is because everyone's running around saying all this stuff, and they're like, they just keep making these assumptions, but then nobody corrects anybody. And there's a point where you have to like start correcting people.
Okay.
But I think we're in agreement about where that point more or less is. I think maybe slightly disagreeing, but it's ever so much. Like, I don't think it's really that important.
So my guess at all of this is that somewhere along the way, some people have really turned you off, and it's left a really bitter taste in your mouth about this, and your radar is more sensitive than mine. And I see the charlatans out there. I just don't pay them any mind. I just move on, right? And it was something really bothers me, I would produce a video and I say, hey, this is totally false, and here's my opinion on it, and you could choose to be in that person's camp or this camp. And again, tomorrow, I'm a learning creature. I'm evolving, changing. I could also say what Chris said, 2 years ago, is incorrect. I've learned more, and this is how I feel about it now. And I do that quite often. Okay, so before I summarize a few things that I think we agree on, I just want to give people, again, some context as to why we're even having this conversation. A lot of what I do, a lot of what I'm teaching is reactionary. It's based on what I feel the community is in pain with, the things that they're struggling with. So I'm wondering why people aren't making more content. I'm wondering why they aren't sharing the gifts that they have, and they're holding back. And my suspicion is that they don't want to step into this expert role or be seen as one because they don't see themselves as one. So they just hold back this dam of content, and then they're having a hard time getting work. Also, I feel that some people mistakenly believe that they are experts at something without having done the minimal amount of research, even going on Wikipedia and looking up certain things. So they're spreading out some misinformation. So my solution to both of those problems was say, hey, people who don't recognize your own strengths and on your path towards expertise, it's okay to just start sharing. That's totally okay. And expertise, to me, is in the eye of the beholder. Conversely, those of you guys that are going around saying these things, let's read 5 books on it. Let's just double check what you're saying, what you think you know, is at least validated by a couple of sources. That's all. And if it's not, course correct and learn on the way up. So it's a win-win situation. Now, I know there's a bunch of people in the group, or not a bunch, a few, who have very strong opinions, what they would consider, and I respect their opinion, but I don't want it to be a thing that holds back the community that we're trying to lift up. Okay. Now, I think you and I are in total agreement. And at each one of these points, when I say it, you're like, no, let's clarify. Okay. Unless I'll take your silence as I agree. First, do not make it your intention to mislead people. Neither of us are advocating for that. And that's called fraud. It will damage your reputation. Second, if you make a claim at something, which we all need to, we all start out at some level an amateur at that thing before we move towards the path of expertise. And I think you agree, expertise is a very rare thing, or being an expert is a very rare thing to achieve, but it's a sliding gradient, and it shouldn't be something that you should feel excluded from, and you can work towards it.
Right.
Now, we also think that there are subjective ways of looking at subjective measures of expertise and objective measures, winning awards, being published, graduating from a certain school with a certain GPA with a certain distinction. Those things are all objective. The rest of it is subjective. I think we all can agree to, if somebody says something about you on your behalf to try to help you, and somebody asks you about that, it is upon your duty at that point in time to give them the relevant information so that you don't seem disingenuous or inauthentic. And I agree with that. The one area where I think we may disagree on is how much of a disclaimer do we need to put out there? Maybe both you and I are good examples, I don't know, of people who are more transparent about what we know, what we don't know than others. But I don't think it's necessary to tell everybody everything that is good and bad about you in the very early part, because what you have to do is you have to filter out what's relevant to them, and to purposely mislead people. That should be your guiding principle. Otherwise, they start reading like legal contracts, whereas, hereto, in reference to. That's how these legal contracts begin. And that's not humans talking to humans. That's just lawyers talking to lawyers. And I don't think that's helpful to anybody. Are you okay with that?
I think so. I think we do disagree slightly on that, just because I think that's going to be different per person.
That's why I say that one for last, by the way.
Yeah, I think it's going to be different per person, right? I think every person's going to have to figure out how much they should share. But I think generally the rule is a little more than you might think, because, you know, while you shouldn't be throwing your flaws out there, I think this is why people get so like vehemently mad when someone like a pastor ends up doing something that's not kosher, you know, or whatever it is, right? That's something that they would like, oh, you didn't do that thing. Because with that status and with that prestige of teaching other people, with that, you know, great power comes responsibility. And I think, well, they're like, well, that's my private life. Or like the president does something that's morally objectable, whichever president, right? Not even just the current president, but any president does. And people get really mad about it. And it's like, well, is that his personal life or not? And it's like, I think the part of the problem is like, if you were in this position, the higher the position of power you are, I kind of think the more responsible you are to start sharing this stuff. So I think that's kind of where I'm at with it. And so it's like, when you're just starting out, don't go around spewing out all this stuff and here's all my problems. And the people are like, well, I'm going to hire this guy. But like the more you gain in power, the more responsibility you have to correct people and to make sure you're putting out the correct information.
I think so. And I think we kind of have to have a deeper conversation about that then. And there's two things that are coming out from this conversation. One is a deeper conversation about imposter syndrome. And two is about what responsibility do you have if you have fame and you have a podium to speak? And I think that's important. Charles Barkley's been famous for like, I'm not your hero. I'm not a role model. I didn't choose to do any of this. I just want to play basketball. Don't tell your kids to watch me or do what I do. Period. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty fair to say too. Just because you're good at something and because people follow you and look up to you, doesn't mean you have to change who you are or say anything that's on people. Okay? Right. And I think we have a culture, unfortunately, that looks up to people who have fame and are celebrities as more important people than they really are. Mm-hmm. However, if you're saying something in that platform, I think you do have a responsibility to be as truthful and honest and authentic about it as you can. And the good news for all of us is it's become harder and harder to hide these kinds of things. Things are busting out all over the place, and you're just only hurting yourself. These are all shortcuts in life, and I don't believe in that at all. So I don't think there's disagreement there.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm glad you came and agreed with me on everything.
Okay, let me wrap this up.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank my guest, Alec Miller, today. And I hope that you who are watching are a little bit more informed or maybe really fired up to leave a comment. So go ahead and do that right now. Leave a comment. Who did you agree with more? Did you agree with Alec's position or mine? Or maybe you're thinking that we're talking about the same thing. We're just chasing our own tails in this conversation. And that could be the case. But nevertheless, what I wanted to do was on this episode of Thinking Critically is to be able to have one topic, one guest dive deep on something, especially if they disagree with me, so that we can find out where we both net out and perhaps change my mind. And that it's safe for people to disagree with me and that I'm not going to cut people off and give them their fair time on air and to be able to express their opinion. So Alec, thanks again for coming on our show and putting the time, energy, and effort in not only forming your opinion, but being able to articulate it and to do the research on what we said and haven't said, and to even to cut that video together that is now being viewed by lots of people. Final thoughts on for this from your point of view?
Yeah, my final thoughts are just, I want people to know that this is how I work out ideas. So while it might sound like I'm just disagreeing with Chris just to fight him, or that, I'm not listening to Chris sometimes, what I'm trying to get is clarity. What I'm trying to get to is, what is it that you really think when you say this? And this is why, because I've made an assumption about Chris. And so me asking him and doing that on my part, I'm taking my responsibility to get to know what Chris really thinks. And, I don't know if anyone else gets rubbed the same way I do by certain things, but if that's the case, I hope this is a valuable way or an example of how you can maybe get some clarity. Like, it's amazing how many people respond if you ask them, hey, do you actually believe that? And rather than us running off and just assuming this is what they think. So thank you, Chris, for having me on, for taking the time to clarify and not just writing me off as a hater. And I really hope we get to do this again sometime. I really enjoy it.
Yes. And I would never write you off as a hater because you're willing to stay in the conversation. The people who to me are total cowards throw out a comment, lob a bomb, and just run. Every time I invite them to come on the show, they just run because I don't know why, but I hope
it's intimidating.
Well, I think because they may think that I'm going to be totally biased, cut them off, and edit the episode in a way that doesn't present them in a fair way. And I'm hoping that when people watch this, they're going to see like there are two sides to everything. I'm willing to move my position on anything. I just want to hear what your point is. And the whole idea about thinking critically is to be able to critique your own thought process. And who else better to do that than a live human being across from you who can share different insights? And I'm going to go back and replay this conversation to see, like, were there things that you brought up, Alec, that I'm going to need to reevaluate in myself? And that's it. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to wish everybody a great day, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and see you guys on the next episode.